Well, hello again, Connecting Point. We're picking up in our study of Judges this week with a sequence where we don't get any characters. Actually, that's not true. There's one character who we'll meet at the very end of our sequence. But this intro section to Judges is doing this transitional work where we're going from the story of Joshua particularly into the story of these other individuals who follow after Joshua and basically fail to live up to his model of leadership. But in this sequence that we have today, we're going to zoom out and look at kind of just little snippets of the stories of the different tribes of Israel. Nicole last week took us through the story of Judah having kind of mostly success in their initial invasion of the land that they're supposed to hold. And then we're going to, and they zoom in on Judah, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But then we're going to kind of go through a bunch of different of the tribes this week. So it's going to be a lot of places and a lot of names and people groups and not a lot of actual characters. And we'll see what we can figure out from this section. One of the thoughts that I came across in doing some pre-reading on Judges was this idea that the 12 books, what we call them sometimes the books of history, Joshua through Esther, is what you'll find in your Old Testament. Some people call it Deuteronomic history. And I thought that was a pretty interesting term. So what is Deuteronomic history? Well, Deuteronomic history means that it's all history that flows from the covenant renewal that happens that Moses leads the Hebrew people through in the book of Deuteronomy. And some scholars have actually even tried to like kind of lift Deuteronomy out of the Pentateuch and shove it into those books of history because they so see Deuteronomy as being this like thesis statement moment for what happens in Joshua through Esther. And I don't see any need to actually lift the Deuteronomy out of the Pentateuch. That seems like foolhardy. But I do like that emphasis that where you get to in Deuteronomy with this place where Moses leaves the people of Israel, choose life and live, or choose the path of destruction, it is a thesis statement for what happens in Joshua through Esther. Judges fits in as the second book in that sequence. So I think it's a really interesting and useful kind of a scheme to have in your brain as you're thinking through this. What this means, though, is that the author has a particular perspective as they write, and it's not just one author. There's multitudes of authors probably compiling that whole historical account from Joshua through Esther. But they have this unique and shared perspective where certain things become of particular importance. And that is that they really emphasize the line of Judah, because the line of Judah is the line of the kingship. And that's a promise back that Jacob gave. It was one of his prophecies that he gave at the very end of the book of Genesis. And so that's a thread that they pick up, and they really are interested in that. Of course, David is the great king from the line of Judah, and the first king from the line of Judah. And so that Judah ends up playing an outsized role in terms of its importance to our storyline. The other thing that becomes really important is that the centers of worship play an outsized role in terms of their importance. So you'll see that particular cities get named, especially because they are where worship centers end up emerging. And so you'll see in our text today, Jerusalem pops up, even though the Israelites don't fully take Jerusalem for another multiple hundred years. But there's this particular emphasis on Jerusalem. But the other names that come up are Bethel and Dan, because both Bethel and Dan end up as cultic centers for, it was a cult for Yahweh, but it was linked with idol worship, and that's something that Jeroboam sets up in the northern kingdom. We'll come back to that idea in a little bit, but I really appreciate Rebecca and Nicole both emphasizing that line from Moses, this idea of choosing life and living, because that frames Deuteronomic history as well. The success or failure of the people is never in terms of their geopolitical status or in terms of their economic well-being or these kinds of things. The success level is always measured in these books of history by, are they choosing life? Are they living according to God's laws and precepts? Are they following what God has for them? Or are they choosing to define good and evil for themselves? And so even in through the king sequences, you'll find kings who are described as having great success militarily, expanding the borders of Israel, but he did not do as his father David had done. And so in terms of not following God or not tearing down the centers of idol worship or all these other things that are like, this is actually what defines success for a king or for a person. And so that's why you end up with this history that is emphasizing both politics but also prophetic ministry. And so this thread of what is God doing becomes super important to the Deuteronomic history. But I think this kind of emphasis on history and how story works is an interesting one to think about in our own lives. How do you think about success in your own life? So we're going to go to a table talk. And this is the question: do you see your life's story in terms of how well or not you're following God's laws at a given time? All right, let's jump into the text. So we're going to pick up in Judges chapter 1, verse 21. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them, and the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all his family go. And the man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, and so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Achlab, or of Achzib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, so they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shaalbim. But the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Okay, so did your eyes also glaze over as I was reading that list? I find the lists in the Bible like this are hard to read because it just becomes this people, place, people, place, people, place. We have other instances like genealogies or in numbers, census data. It just becomes this like machine gun kind of a thing of just name, number, name, number. And I repeat myself. So it kind of begs a question: how on earth do you approach a text like this and try to figure out something of use from it? Why is it included? Well, there's a couple things we can do. The first thing that we can do is we can note what the pattern is. I watch a particular music theorist's YouTube channel, and he has a phrase which he says, repetition legitimizes. And to describe how in a song or in a piece of music, if you do something weird, you can do that weird thing, and as long as you repeat that weird thing, it makes it just part of the song or the piece. So I think that is the way that it works in the Bible too, to some degree. When you see that repetition, when you see that piece repeated over and over again, that's the thing that you want to pull out of that text. So we'll look for that ingredient in our list today. They're not especially action-packed all the time, but the repetition is what makes it emphasized. But then as you're looking through that pattern, you also have to look for what it is that's like sticking out like a sore thumb as you're reading that pattern. If there's a repetitive thing that's happening and then there's a deviation from it, or if there's a callback to a previous section and then there's this remixing or rejigging of the story, what about that should we notice? And so that's the other thing that we're going to be looking for as we go through this text. One thing that I wanted to mention briefly before we get into the notes from the text specifically is what the kind of the political landscape of Palestine was at this point in the game. Egypt had a unified kingdom. So there was a pharaoh who had, overseers of these different provinces and areas and cities of his kingdom. But it was all flowing up to, like a pyramid, all flowing up to the pharaoh in a unified kind of a government apparatus. But in most of the rest of the world at this time, they don't have large empires with large kings overseeing large, pieces of land. In the Mesopotamian world that Abraham came out of, all of those little cities that you hear named in Abraham's story are individual city-states. They don't have a unified ruler. They have maybe a unified culture. They have a unified pantheon of gods that they worship and that kind of a thing. But they don't actually have a unified polity, as it were. And that's the same with the Canaanites at this point. There's not a unified polity. There's a unified culture. They all worship Baal and Asher, and they have their various little local city gods that they worship, but they're broadly following the same polytheistic religion. They don't have a unified king over all of them. And that's why you see so many little kings get conquered in the Joshua story. It's why you see so many different groups rise up to oppress the Israelites as we go through the book of Judges. They're city-states, and they're operating as, so you'd have an ascendant city-state for a while, and then they'd go into kind of a time of disrepair or disrepute, or they'd get beaten up by a conglomeration of allies, but then the allies wouldn't stick together as a kingdom. They'd go back into their own city-state ways. It's just kind of what you're looking at, and that actually goes true for the Hebrews as well at this point. They're less of a unified, cohesive group than a set of 12 tribes who have worked together for a time under Joshua. They do theoretically have a unified religion and a unified culture, but they don't have a specific king above them. They don't have a specific leader above them. And so as we go through Judges, you're going to see that Othniel leads Judah, but he doesn't lead Zebulun or Dan or any of the other tribes. That's not really his prerogative. They're supposed to be all unified around God, and that works out to a pretty bad degree, as we'll see as we go through. By the time we get to the end of the book, Rebecca hinted at this a couple weeks back, we end up in civil war between the tribes. Like, they're really not a unified people, and they have as much disdain for each other often as they do for the other groups that they're in conflict with. So we'll kind of jump back into our text here. We move slowly north through the Holy Land as we get into this list of tribal allotments. Judah's in the south. Judah and Simeon are the two most southern of the tribes. Benjamin is the next one to the north, and that's where we start in verse 21. Then it kind of runs its way up through the further north. Joseph is Ephraim and Manasseh. They're the two half tribes of Joseph. They are mentioned next. Zebulun, Naphtali. These are actually Galilean tribes. That's the land that they're supposed to be fighting, is in what becomes the Galilee during the time of Jesus. So kind of an interesting side note. But that's kind of the pattern that we're going to follow. And we're actually going to follow that pattern through the story as we start with our first judge, Othniel, in a couple weeks in the south, or next week. And then we're going to kind of track northward and then back south to Samson. Samson ends us off as the final named judge specifically, and he's also in the south fighting against the Philistines, who are the big bad of the southern tribes, against the southern tribes. And you'll recognize that name probably from, if you've ever read 1st or 2nd Samuel, that's Saul and David's primary enemy is the Philistines still. So that's where we go. We begin with Benjamin's failure to hold Jerusalem specifically. And if you'll recall last week, Nicole said that Judah had actually done some of the work in striking Jerusalem. The verb is unclear exactly what happens. At any rate, Benjamin doesn't hold the city. And the Jebusites, are still there, and that's the name of the people who live there. Jerusalem, before it's called Jerusalem, is actually called Jebus in some of your Bibles. So that will be a useful thing to remember, possibly. Benjamin actually ends up becoming the focal point of the big tribal conflict at the end of the book. And so starting with Benjamin here is kind of interesting, because at the end of the story, we're going to come full circle and see Benjamin's failure to hold Jerusalem has these further ramifications on the way that Benjamin deals with the rest of the tribes. As we go through, though, then we see Manasseh and Ephraim are mentioned next. They also get a little more emphasis than the other tribes, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali. The rationale for this is that Joseph is your big character in the end of the book of Genesis, and so from his line, it's also a significant line. Joshua also, if you'll recall from last week, Joshua gave a prophecy or a specific charge to Ephraim and Manasseh and said, you guys are large and you are very effective and you should be able to hold your land. And that was the kind of the charge that they were given, and they, you see here, failed to do so. They also have this town that's called Bethel, which we'll come back to at the end of our story today in the next section. But you'll remember that Bethel, if you've read Genesis lately, you might not remember this, but you'll recall that Abraham and Jacob both meet with God at Bethel, and it continues to be a place of cultic significance, as I had mentioned earlier. Jeroboam, who is the split king of the northern 10 tribes after Rehoboam and Jeroboam can't figure out, or Rehoboam fails to hold Solomon's kingdom together. You can find this in 2 Kings, or 1 Kings. Rehoboam fails to hold the kingdom together, and Jeroboam splits off the northern tribes. And Jeroboam is like, well, we don't want to be sending all our people down to Jerusalem to do sacrifice at the Jerusalem temple, even though we know that's what's supposed to happen. So what he does is he actually has 2 golden calves made, and he sets up one in the southern part of Israel in Bethel and one in the northern part in Dan. And he says, if you can't make it to Jerusalem, and by the way, don't try to make it, guys, go to Bethel or Dan and do your sacrifices there, because we have Yahweh there. And I've set up a golden calf to represent Yahweh. You'd think he would have learned from their history, but no, he failed to learn from the history, immediately breaking at least one of the commandments. So you can find that whole sequence in 1 Kings chapter 12 if you're interested in reading about Bethel and Dan as these cult centers. Ephraim and Manasseh have this interesting story that's told about them as the tribes of Joseph go together to take Bethel, which was a city called Luz. And it calls back to the story from the early part of the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 2, when Rahab is turned, she's a lady of the night who works in in Jericho, and she is turned for the Israelites as the spies come into the city of Jericho, and they're trying to figure out a way into the city defenses and all this kind of stuff. Rahab meets them, hides them from the guards of Jericho, and is able to free them to go back to give their report on the city of Jericho. And she makes a deal with the spies and says, guys, when you come in and take over the city, I want to be on God's side. I don't want to be on the side of these guys. I'm not with them. And so remember me and my family. And so they go back to Joshua and they say, this is the deal that happened. And Joshua says, okay, certainly we're going to honor that agreement that you had. And so Rahab is actually then integrated into the covenant people of Israel in Joshua chapter 2. And it's a very interesting story. And you actually find Rahab in the lineage of Jesus in the genealogy that Matthew gives us in Matthew chapter 1. However, our story is remixed. And so we have the spies go into the city, they're making a deal, and you're kind of like, oh, good. They're turning the people into, like, they're restoring blessing to these people, right? This is the job of the holy war, isn't it? Is to restore blessing and to stop the idolatry and the evil that's been happening. No, they don't do that. They fail to do that. These people, they just say, okay, we'll make a deal and then you can go your way. And the guy goes his way, and he goes and he carries on. He names his new city Luz, after the city that he just fled. And so it's clear that they're not really operating fully the way that God intended them, where if you bring people in, bring them in, right? And integrate them into this people who are supposed to be a blessing to the land. And we see this sequence carry on as the people of Israel, these tribes of Israel, they start to gain power, but they don't act as a blessing to the land that they are coming into. The next sequence that follows is it's that really machine gun like rhythm of, and this tribe didn't drive out their inhabitants. Wash, rinse, and repeat. The section tracks northwards, as I said, but what we see is that this phrase, forced labor, becomes really important. All these tribes are subjected to forced labor under the thumb of the Israelites. And where do we hear that word before? In the book of Exodus. And it's the very oppression that the people of Israel called out to God and said, save us from these evil Egyptians, from this people, or from this group who's oppressing us. Now they're the oppressor. And so just the same way that we saw in last week's story where the thumbs and big toes of Adonai Bezek were cut off as a revenge and as a humiliation of this pagan foreign king. Now Israel is actually performing this systematic repression of the people that they're supposed to be just displacing or changing and turning into a people who can be receiving God's blessing and part of God's covenant people. It beggars the imagination to think of the Exodus people with the wonders that they see through the story of the Exodus, this living memory of the conquest that Joshua leads them through and the miraculous signs that God performs, and within a generation or two, they're already slipping back into just playing power politics and playing the game the way that everybody else around them does. The last paragraph that we have in our this first section shows Dan's particular failure. So Dan is one of the tribes of Israel, but they are a particular disaster in terms of holding their land. And it's unclear why exactly that is, if they were just particularly faithless, or if the Amorites that they're going up against in that very far north of Israel are particularly strong at this point. But the Amorites actually lead that paragraph, and that's significant. The Amorites press the people of Dan back into the hill country. If you'll recall from Genesis, again, Abraham is asking about the promised land, and God says, okay, the Amorites haven't reached their full measure of their iniquity yet, and so we're going to send you off to be a sojourner for a while longer, and then your people will come back and take out the Amorites. We're going to let them become fully evil first. And so this is a fully evil group. The Amorites are an enemy, and you can read about some of their practices. It's really bad, gross religious stuff, and systematically evil. And Dan is unable to deal with them and is actually forced back. There's an interesting word that's used where it's Dan doesn't have the willpower, it seems, in the way that the translation works, and the Amorites persist in dwelling. And there's this weird phrase that I think is worth camping out on for a minute. When we're in our holy war, I think sometimes we get discouraged or we lose the willpower to continue to fight, and we start to just kind of relax our standards, whatever it is that we need to be holding to, persisting in righteousness, pursuing righteousness, and pursuing God's will. And we sometimes let the enemy persist in our lives. And we sometimes have this same fight. I know I have this same fight that the Danites had sometimes, where I'm not as willful about doing good as the enemy or whatever it is in my life is willful about having evil done in my life and seeing evil done in my life. So I just wanted to ask you to reflect on that for a minute. Here's a table talk for this section. Does it sometimes feel this way in your own holy war against sin and the enemy in your life? Does it sometimes feel like you don't have the willpower and that sin has somehow more willpower than you do? And what can we do about that? So, go ahead. All right, let's pick up our text, and we're actually going to go into the first part of chapter 2. So we'll pick up at chapter 2, verse 1, and we're going to read through verse 5. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. Okay, so we actually have a particular character to talk about, and that is this angel of the Lord character. And this way of describing God has been absent from our chronology for actually 2 full books. Deuteronomy doesn't have the phrase the angel of the Lord, and Joshua doesn't have the phrase the angel of the Lord, but it is found frequently in the 4 previous books of the Pentateuch, and we will see it 22 times in the book of Judges. In Judges, it mostly corresponds to the sequences where Gideon and Samson are spoken to. And it's unclear precisely what is going on with this phrase, angel of the Lord. You can kind of start to use your imagination, but here's some of the previous instances from the Pentateuch that will help to make it make sense, hopefully. Exodus 3, when Moses encounters the burning bush, that is the phrase that is used to describe God's presence, speaking out of the burning bush, as the angel of the Lord. In chapter 14 of Exodus, it's the same phrase, angel of the Lord, used to describe the pillar of cloud and fire that leads the Israelites through the desert. The angel of the Lord is the being who also is specifically described in Genesis when Hagar runs out into the desert after she's been dismissed by Abraham and Sarah, and she's ready to die. She's just hates her life in this whole thing. And Hagar is met by the angel of the Lord and is told about the provision that he has for her. And then Abraham actually ends up meeting with this angel of the Lord character as well. In Numbers, the angel of the Lord is the character who appears to talk to Balaam, the strange prophet fella who is supposed to go and curse the Israelites and then is unable to, and he talks with a donkey. And his story is, if there's a reason to read the book of Numbers, beyond, like just reading the repetitive machine gun lists, Balaam is really your guy. He's quite a fascinating set of stories with him. And then Matthew actually uses this same phraseology, angel of the Lord, to describe the angel that appears to Joseph in the dream, telling Joseph to accept Mary and Jesus and then to take Mary and Jesus out to Egypt to avoid Herod's slaughtering of the innocents that's described in Matthew. So this character, the angel of the Lord, moves himself in this sequence at the beginning of chapter 2 from Gilgal to Bochim. So Gilgal had been where the main camp of the Israelites had been immediately once they crossed the Jordan River. Joshua met with God there in some way, although it never uses the phrase the angel of the Lord. Many scholars say that Bochim is actually Bethel, and that is describing this move into the land from the bridgehead into the center of the land. Bethel's kind of central to the promised land. It's inside of Joseph's territory, Ephraim and Manasseh, but it is pretty close to the border with the Judahites in their land. So that's kind of an interesting detail. Bochim as a word means weeping, and it doesn't seem to be a name that sticks, but it is. This place now, Bethel, is being called Bochim, it seems, that's what the scholarship says on this. The move signals that the people have come out of the initial phases of the conquest and into a settlement period of the land. But it also signifies the pain and the failure that is going on as it's described as a place of weeping. I really love that the angel uses this particular phrase in addressing the people of the word of Israel. He says, "What is this you have done?" And that is the exact direct quote that God asks Eve back in Genesis chapter 3 after it's described where Adam describes what Eve has, led him into eating the fruit, and he's passing the buck, and then Eve tries to pass the buck, and God says, "What is this you have done?" And so this phrase, "what is this you have done," specifically has to do with this defining of good and evil for yourself, of failing to do what God told you to do. And it is it's the response God has to sin. What is this you've done? And I like that there's an expectation with it, that we know when things are going right or wrong, and we know when we've done something wrong, and so God just lays it out and just asks, what is this you have done? There's no there's no need for him to like be a bully about it and be really condemning about it. It's this, you're condemned by your own conscience at this point, kind of a thing almost. The people have kind of a correct response to this. It's appropriate to weep, right? When you're caught out in your sin and whatever it is, the scales fall from your eyes or something like that, or it's pointed out to you, hey, you're behaving really, really terribly. What is this you have done? I think the correct thing to do is to weep and then to sacrifice. Those are both correct. However, it is of significance in this portion that there's no mention of them turning from their evil ways or confession or tearing down the idols, which are what you'll usually find in the other parts of the Old Testament when the authors are describing a full repentance of the Israelite people. So it's unclear from this text if Israel is truly repentant or if it's just this performative thing where they're trying to show God, oh yeah, we're really sorry, and it's this, demonstrative sadness, but it doesn't actually change their heart. And we're not really in a position to judge what's going on at this point, but we don't see the angel of the Lord relenting and saying, okay, I see your repentant heart, let's get back on track here. It's thorns and snares. This is what the persistent pagans, these persistent Amorites, this is what they're going to be. They're going to be a thorn. They're going to be a snare. Their gods are going to be a snare, and it's going to be bad. I was listening to an atheist sociologist talking to a couple of Christian guys on a podcast this week, and they were talking about the hyper-political correctness movement, and he was talking about it in religious terms, which I thought was interesting. But he was describing how religions kind of work from this like completely unfaith-driven perspective. And he talked about up religions and down religions. And he was saying what we're seeing in our society with cancel culture and all these other things where people are being condemned for having the wrong feelings and the wrong attitudes and systemic and systematic and all these kinds of words that are used about racism or sexism or all these things that are problems in our society. But what it does is it makes it a hopeless place. And he says what we're looking at is a down religion in the hyper political correctness of our society right now. There's this emphasis on what has gone wrong. There's this emphasis on sin and guilt, and there's actually no mechanism for absolution in this thing. And I think that's one of the things that we can kind of see as we look at the Judges, is the law becomes a down religion for the people of Israel. They forget to see the law as a means of God's grace to them. And so I think that's what leads to this performative thing where the Israelites, if that's what's going on at the end of this section, they perform as if they need absolution, but there's no actual way of having grace reintegrated into their life. And I think it's an interesting way to look at it, at religion and what it does in us. Sometimes we get really obsessed on the down, on our sin, on our depravity, on the dangers of damnation, on the, all those kinds of things. But then other times we get really focused on the up part of the religion, and I think that's also a bit of a pitfall, though, because we get into naivety, right? It becomes prosperity, and God has blessing for you and not cursing, and God has all this. And really, when you look at Christianity, and this was actually one of the atheist guys' interesting points, was that Christianity actually does seem to do a pretty good job of holding them both together. Even the most hardcore into depravity branches of Christianity, like a hyper-Calvinist kind of a thing, has this massive emphasis on God's grace and on how there's this upward trajectory for what is possible in the Christian faith. And he was complimentary of it. I think he's got some thinking to do still further about this thing, obviously. But it was an interesting thought to me of how do I approach this religion? Am I going to approach it like the Israelites? Do I feel a need to perform to try to get God's approval? Am I worried about that? Or is it all blessing all the time and my life is just tickety-boo and hunky-dory and whatever other old-timey phrase you want to use to describe how good life can be? The cross really shows us the dichotomy of it, as justice is brought down and God's grace intervenes on our behalf. And we need to hold them both together. Christianity is supposed to be an up and down religion. We're supposed to be aware of sin and aware of the effects of the brokenness in our world, but not be hopeless. because God is good and faithful, even when we are not. And you see it as God's then, like, despite God saying they're going to be a thorn and a snare, what happens when the people repent and turn to God? He sends a judge. He sends this means of grace. And we're going to see that throughout our story, that grace is still something that intervenes on behalf of this really broken, hurting people who keep performing badly and keep getting into power politics and oppression and all the things that they shouldn't be doing. That's kind of where I want to leave you, is this introduction to this cycle of the judges that we're going to see. And that's going to be our final table talk today, is like, do you tend to see your faith in God more on this upwards thing or on this downwards thing? And how can you better hold the two together in tension? Have yourselves a great week.